getting their pizza and taking their seats, we have a few announcements. This is not to rush everybody, but before we get started, I wanted to introduce the SBA president, who has a few updates for all of you. We start with the SBA president.
Yeah, so for anyone who was not there yesterday, the newly formed faculty committee on career development had an informational panel discussing their initiatives and goals for this year, ways they're going to reach out and help students to network and find time to resume review and learn about different practice areas around the school. So all over school you're going to see these QR reader papers. There's a couple of giant boards up in the cafeteria, and you're going to get an email later today or tomorrow from me, so please read that. With these as links, there's 11 different practice areas on here, including human rights and immigration law, things like that. So I'll pass these around, but you can sign up for these listservs and receive information from various professors around the school who really want to help you learn about different employment opportunities, networking events, mini career fairs that they're all putting together. So I'll just kind of pass these around. I only have a few of them, but look for the email. You can click on the link that will be attached to this email and sign up for one or all. And you have till Monday to sign up because they're going to start giving you information very soon. So thank you all. Pass a few of these around.
Thanks. There's also a table outside. There's a table with information. Step outside. I myself am actually going to have to step out of this to go to a faculty working group on jobs for international law in a few minutes after we make the introductions and announcements. I want to say I am, whether you recognize me or not, Hadar Harris, the Executive Director of the Center for Human Rights and Humanitarian Law. We'll just discuss briefly the radical shift in hairstyle. Although I was going to kind of keep it more quiet, yesterday or on Sunday afternoon, I participated in something called Be Brave and Shake, which is an initiative of Children's National Hospital raising money for research for bone marrow transplants for children. They are in the midst at this point of curing sickle cell disease, which apparently can be cured through bone marrow transplants. But there are not enough African American families or people registered in the bone marrow donor registry, and so they are doing a clinical trial of a half-match protocol to be able to do bone marrow transplants with one parent matching the child's blood type. It would revolutionize bone marrow transplants generally for any disease. So happily, this community at WCL, as well as friends and family from across the country and world, helped me in this initiative, as well as my soon-to-be 7-year-old son, who participated as well. And so you'll watch it as it grows back in this science experiment. But if anyone has any questions, I'm happy to answer them. It may keep it this way, though. I kind of like it. Anyway, we are pleased to have Professor Rick Wilson here today for our second installment on Munching on Human Rights. Before I introduce him formally, a couple announcements of upcoming events. On Thursday night, as you all know, the 14th annual Human Rights Film Series is going on. Our third film, which you absolutely must have to attend at 5:30 in the Katzen Center, is Gideon's Army, about the challenge of access to counsel, or challenges to access to counsel, and the work that public defenders do. Our own Angela Davis will be speaking together with the filmmaker at the event. It's 5:30, it's free, it's at the Katzen Arts Center, and so we would strongly encourage you to attend that event. In addition, next Thursday is the last installment of the film series, a film called The Act of Killing, about transitional justice in Indonesia. So the film series has been very well attended. We hope and look forward to having 2 more successful events. On Friday, this Friday, the Student Advisory Board, I should have you guys make this announcement, but I'll just do it quickly, is holding the next Human Rights Coffee Hour, which is a great opportunity for students, faculty, and staff to actually talk about human rights issues in a discussion format, not a lecture format. And so the topic of discussion for this Friday's coffee hour will be statelessness in the Dominican Republic. There was just a decision that came down that that many of you seem to be familiar with because you're nodding your heads going, yeah, there's a lot to talk about, that denationalized, is that the right way to put it? That stripped citizenship and prevents citizenship for many people within the DR. So our clinic has been working on, is it our clinic or was it David?
David, but we still use it in the clinic all the time.
So we have been involved in this issue as a school, and I would encourage you to come to that. And then finally, on Tuesday, October 29th, we have a major yada yada panel set up about employment discrimination in the workplace based on sexual orientation. There are details about it out in front. I'm not going to go through the whole panel, but it really is quite a prestigious panel. The panel itself was set up by one of our Dean's Fellows from last summer who was really enthusiastic about the topic and worked with us to put it together. So we're excited about that. In this very room, Tuesday, October 29th at 12 p.m. That said, Professor Rick Wilson has been a professor. Oh, they gave me a bio. You've been a professor. So now we're going to find out what you actually say you do. He's the founding director of the International Human Rights Law Clinic here at WCL, one of the first anywhere in the world. He's been a professor here since 1989. We will not ask what year all of you were born in. He has litigated many kinds of cases, including representing detainees at Guantanamo through the work of our clinic, arguing before the Inter-American Court of Human Rights, working with the European Union on death penalty issues that would be against the death penalty, as well as many, many other topics. But one of the things most close to his heart is talking about economic, social, and cultural rights. One of the other things closest to his heart is much again, human rights. And so we thank Professor Wilson for making his annual appearance with us, and I throw it over to you, Rick. Thank you guys for coming.
Thank you all. And just with regard to the Inter-American Court of Human Rights, some of you may be aware that last week 2 students from the clinic and I were in Mexico City for a special session of the Inter-American Court of Human Rights to talk about issues of migrant children in the United States, an issue that invokes a lot of the economic, social, and cultural rights that we're talking about today. And 2 students did a terrific job in presenting their views on behalf of three NGOs from the United States who had compiled their views for presentation to the court in deciding an advisory opinion. And this is the first time that we've had students appear at the court and speak on behalf of the clinic. So it was quite a proud moment for me and for the school, I think. More, I think, will follow up on the homepage of the law school, I hope. I want to start by asking how many of you in the room are first-year students? I bet there are a lot next door in the comment section. Okay, how many of you are not from the United States? Good. Okay. A good representation. I'm going to start with, so how many LLMs? Some of the same group? Yeah, terrific. Okay, no, they're a little different. Okay, wonderful. I have a couple of pop quizzes. One first, who said this? Government has a final responsibility to the well-being of its citizenship. If private cooperative effort fails to provide work for willing hands and relief for the unfortunate, those suffering hardship through no fault of their own have the right to call upon the government for aid. And a government worthy of its name must make fitting response. Yes?
Was that John Maynard Keynes?
No, that's a good guess. What do you think? Yeah?
FDR.
Excellent. Good guess. That's exactly right. This was Franklin Roosevelt in his annual message to Congress in 1938. Not a call that we are likely to hear today from either party. Somehow, the issue of government's responsibility to care for those who can't help themselves very rarely makes an appearance on the agenda, and usually it's together with calls for reform of assistance to the poor or deprivation of assistance to the poor, as in elimination of food stamps programs in the recent Congress, or at least a proposal to do that. And when we talk about economic, social, and cultural rights, we are essentially talking about taking care of the poor, because most of the economic, social, and cultural rights we're going to look at today are rights that most of us enjoy every day. They are not in the realm of the civil and political rights that you find most commonly in our Bill of Rights in the U.S. Constitution. And when we talk about fundamental human rights in the United States, we tend to associate them with the rights of the Bill of Rights, which don't mention economic, social, and cultural rights. And if you look at the jurisprudence of our U.S. Supreme Court, you'd be hard-pressed to find support for economic, social, and cultural rights in that jurisprudence. So here's the second part of the pop quiz. Recognition. Who's this? Yes? Malala Yousafzai. Yeah. Everybody know this person? Recognize this person? She's now acquired amazing stature and amazing recognition on a worldwide basis. Nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize. Young, 16-year-old Pakistani woman who was shot in the face for defending and exercising her right to obtain an education. Education is one of the economic, social, and cultural rights we're going to look at today. We don't usually associate education with violence or criminal wrongdoing, but anybody know who this is? I'd be surprised if you do. This is Tanya McDowell. She's from Bridgeport, Connecticut, and last year Tanya was sentenced to serve 5 years in prison of a 12-year sentence for having enrolled her child in the wrong public school. She worked for a family that lived in a wealthy school district, and she used their address to enroll her son in that school system and was discovered halfway through the year. So now she's serving 5 years in prison for the felony of fraudulent enrollment. She's also paying back the $6,200 that the school system spent on her son, says the prosecutor, inappropriately. So, again, education is in play, and education has consequences. Attempting to enroll your child in the wrong school system, in her case, had criminal consequences. And hers is not the first case. Another African-American woman in the Midwest was also sentenced for that offense of false enrollment of her child a year earlier. So there's precedent for this action. I found this pretty shocking and pretty disturbing, that criminal consequences obtained. When Franklin Roosevelt spoke those words back in 1938, we were coming out of a depression in this country, And he also is famed for his discussion of the so-called four freedoms. Do you remember, anybody remember what the four freedoms are? You guys remember what the four freedoms are? Four freedoms. The four freedoms that Franklin Roosevelt talked about are the freedom of speech, freedom of worship, so we're right in our familiar First Amendment territory. The third was freedom from want. And the fourth was freedom from fear. And I spoke about fear, I think, because this was during the rise of the Nazi Party in Germany. We were between wars, but the United States was getting sort of drawn inexorably towards the war in Europe. And we wanted people to feel free from fear. And we recognized these, but freedom from want, not, again, so much in play today, except when it's discussed in conjunction with a challenge to the right to be free from want. And the assumption is that only the worthy poor are entitled to protection. And the worthy poor are those who wouldn't abuse the system to take advantage of it to obtain benefits to which they aren't entitled. People like Tanya McDowell. Those issues are all too frequently combined with issues of race and gender to make the impact of economic, social, and cultural right deprivation much more significant for people of color, for children, for women, and for other identifiable populations that are more affected by their loss. So, for those of you who are tech proficient, I didn't bring a handout, but you may want to just Google Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights Covenant so you can look along with me as I'm talking about these rights today. And if you want to pull that up on your phones or your iPads or your laptops, just the text of the covenant, the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights is what I'm suggesting. And these were a couple of samples that I pulled up there, and I think if you just Google it, you'll find it pretty quickly and easily. But I have a crib sheet for those of you who don't have your electronic devices with you, so that we can look at these. And here's an example of the text. When we look at the rights in the Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, these are the rights that we're seeing in play. Work and Social Security, an adequate standard of living, and this is the words from the treaty itself. So an adequate standard of living we tend to associate with something about maybe wages, something about the right to earn a living. We also associate it with food, and I put and water in parentheses because there actually isn't a right to water in the covenant, but it's been read into it along with the right to food. So the treaty body that interprets the words for food in the treaty has implied a right to water sufficient to go along with the food. So access to water, it actually turns out to be another significant issue for a significant portion of the world's population. Article 11 also contains a right to housing, and it's stated in that term, so it's not shelter, it's housing. And there's, I think, a little bit of difference legally between the right to housing and a right to just shelter. Shelter could just be a piece of roof over the top of a place where you sleep. Housing is something more. And I think, again, the committee has spoken to that. And a number of organizations today are making a pitch that the route to improving or eliminating poverty in the world is not by providing subsistence assistance to people, by giving them money assistance, or even giving them food, but giving them a place to stay first. The right to a house and a stable place to go home to and live and have a family is the most fundamental indicator of stability in your ability to get ahead and catch up with the rest of the world. And then the others, health, education, and cultural life. And cultural life is one of those terms that didn't have a lot of content at the time that the treaty was adopted, but has acquired a good deal of content in recent years, particularly as we're talking about the protection of traditional cultures, indigenous peoples, and cultural identity, preservation of cultural identity when one goes from one culture to another. There was a period of time, certainly my father, whose parents came from Sweden, was told not to speak Swedish at home because he was an American now. So he never learned Swedish, he learned English. And it's true even in some of my own students' homes today, but most folks like to preserve cultural identity by teaching their children the language, at least, of the culture they come from. So there is a good deal of discussion today about culture and about identity. And this also is the arena in which we generally find the contest over intellectual issues, intellectual property. So intellectual property is oftentimes associated with cultural rights. So, what's the difference, and why are these two sets of rights so radically separated from each other? If we think about civil and political rights, we think certainly about those first couple of rights that Franklin Roosevelt talked about, speech and religion, right? But we also think about a number of other civil and political rights that are likely to be in play in almost all of the constitutions of the world, and are likely to be in play in judicial decisions around the world that have to do with issues like participation in the politics of the country, political participation, voting, holding office, eligibility for office, etc., tends to be associated with civil and political rights, as do all of the issues that are associated with fair trial, the right to counsel, and other issues around that question. The right to family and protection of family kind of rides an intersection between the two. So one might be able to talk about an adequate standard of living and talk about it in the family context. I don't believe that the words are used in that particular way. They're used in an individual context, and the Civil and Political Covenant tends to talk about family and children explicitly. And of course, the other covenants that come, the other treaties that come after these two major treaties talk more explicitly about family protection, protection of women, protection of children. So, if we look back at the, before we go on to the looking back, these are this is a focus of what are called the general comments of the Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. Every UN treaty, for those of you who haven't been exposed to this particular structure, every UN treaty in the core human rights treaties has a committee that is created by the treaty itself that's charged with its administration. It's charged with enforcing, if you will, the provisions of that particular treaty. Those vary in size and membership, and the individuals who are appointed to them are usually appointed in their individual capacity as experts on the issues of the particular committee in question. And they serve a particular time period and then move on. Most of you are aware, for example, of our own Dean Grossman, who is the president now, I believe, of the Committee Against Torture, one of the UN treaties, core human rights treaties, that has a committee that administers it. The Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights does a number of things. Its primary role is to supervise the submission of reports from countries that are parties to the treaty to say, here's our periodic report showing what we've done to comply with these rights in our country, and the committee holds a session, they review the report, they ask questions of the country in question, and then issue comments about that compliance. And it's usually done in very gentle diplomatic terms. It's not a confrontational process. It's a process that's designed to encourage countries to engage in the vindication of these rights and to progressively achieve compliance with the treaties. So that's what they do. That's their primary task. The second task they have, though, is to interpret the treaty. And that's where these general comments come in. So general comments of the committee are written after the treaty has chewed on the rights for a while and experienced the submission of many reports from many different countries, and they've kind of seen what the texture of them looks like. They use their expertise to say, well, we think we need to say a little bit more about these particular rights. And if you look at the comments by the Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, there are a number of them that focus on the content of the rights and the interpretation of them. The first, and the one I have in italics, is one called minimum core content, which is one that they felt driven to because it was very hard to quantify what the right to food means. Does it mean let's go out and buy McDonald's burgers every day? Or does it mean nutrition of a certain level? And if so, is it a certain calorie intake? Is it a certain kind of food that's culturally appropriate? Religiously appropriate? There are all kinds of issues you can get into immediately about food. So what they tried to do was set some guidelines about what they believe to be the sort of minimum core content of all the economic, social, and cultural rights. Then they went on to elaborate in some greater detail about these rights to work, Social Security, food, water, housing, health, education, culture. So they've given a lot more content, and these general comments tend to be anything from 3 to 10 or 12 pages of dense analysis about what the content of the rights are. So when you think about economic, social, and cultural rights versus the civil and political rights that are in our Bill of Rights, why do you suppose these bodies of rights got separated from each other along the way? What do you think was going on? Why did these two bodies of rights get separated? And let me give you maybe a hint. They are the treaties, the two treaties, civil and political and economic, social, and cultural right, are adopted in not, they're adopted after the Universal Declaration on Human Rights in 1948, which contains both sets of rights, civil and political and economic, social, and cultural. 1966, we see these two treaty regimes emerge. What do you think is going on? Yes?
It had to do with that the USSR and certain other similarly politically aligned countries did not want to adopt these rights because then they would have to give certain things to their people, which they were very reluctant to do
So, Soviet Union only?
No, it was several other countries as well.
Right. So that's one side of the equation. And what's the other side of the equation?
Us. And basically the modern Western world.
The United States and its allies. This is Cold War time. So through 1948, we're able to keep it together, keep the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, keeps all of these rights together. But by 1966, we're in a polarized world with the Soviet sphere and the American sphere. And I don't think this is overly simplistic. I think this is, there are some people who say this is too easy an analysis for why these two treaty instruments emerge in the particular time that they do. But I think it's accurate to say that within those two spheres of influence, there was a belief that the countries in question either wanted or didn't want to protect certain bodies of rights over other bodies of rights. So you said Soviet Union on one side and U.S. on the other. Who do you think was mostly protecting economic, social, and cultural rights? Scandinavia, definitely.
Of those two?
Pardon?
Of those two?
Yeah.
The USSR.
USSR and the U.S.
The civil and political.
Civil and political. Because that's where our Bill of Rights is. That's what the U.S. Constitution contains. That's the Civil and Political Covenant, or the Civil and Political Covenant reflects the same content that we would see in our own civil and political rights. The economic and cultural rights tended to be associated with the East, if you will, the Soviet Union, and later China, that came in on the same side, who argued that these rights were more important than civil and political rights. And today, you will see that of the major powers in the world, the United States has yet to ratify this treaty, the Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, whereas China has yet to ratify the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, but has ratified this treaty. So it is a more complex political arena today than it was back in the Cold War. And I think it's easier to think about these issues more as maybe north and south, or poor and rich. And that's how I tend to kind of make the division. It's between the countries that are more affluent or less affluent. Although there's definitely a connection between the amount of liberty and the amount of freedom in a particular culture and the extent to which it's going to honor economic, social, and cultural rights versus civil and political rights. So, there is there's been a general belief over time that economic, social, and cultural rights are not really rights. In fact, when I used to give this talk, I would start with what were the four most prevalent myths about economic, social, and cultural rights. And those myths were the following. First, that they are not rights at all. They're aspirations. That's the position that our government has taken up through at least this administration. There's been a little bit more in the Obama administration, a little bit more lip service toward these rights. And in the UN and other places, Obama has talked about, and the people from the State Department have talked about the ways in which the United States acts to implement these rights. But if you look down this list of rights and think about where these rights get vindicated in the United States, most of them don't get vindicated because of court decisions, and they're very much at play in the political arena, like this one. Obamacare? Anyone? So we contest these rights. They're always on the political agenda, and they're always in dispute. They're not a given, like the right to freedom of speech or freedom of religion. Housing, education, all of those issues. The woman who goes to jail for exercising a right to education for her child shows that even in the United States, where primary education is widely available, and a lot of kids finish high school, there's still a contest over what education is and how it should be made available equally and widely to everyone, regardless of race, regardless of where you live. It is still a contested right. So, the second myth is that these rights are so-called second-generation rights. That is, the first generation is civil and political. The second generation is economic, social, and cultural. And I don't buy the generational distinction. I think there's a lot of indication, and there's some stuff in our slides, that suggests that those rights are co-equal and that they should be valued in the same way as civil and political rights. Others argue that economic, social, and cultural rights are positive rights and that civil and political rights are negative rights. That is, that in the case of civil and political rights, all we need to do is get out of the way. Government needs to stay out of the way and let these rights be cherished and invoked. So, in order to have freedom of religion and freedom of speech, government just needs to stand aside, let you speak, let you go to church. They don't need to do anything to make it happen. Now, even that, I think you could contest. I mean, if you live here in Washington and you think about who can speak where, when, and who can march where and when, and who needs a permit where and when, and who's going to get arrested if they march when they shouldn't be, the freedom of expression is also contested, and we use a lot of money to make sure that it gets exercised in a controlled way. And the state's been involved in the exercise of free religion for a long time in lots and lots of different ways. So even that claim is difficult to sustain. But there is a sort of knee-jerk sense in which civil and political rights feel like they're rights that don't cost us anything, and that the right to food and the right to housing and the right to health, particularly for poor people, are going to cost us all money. Because you can't have that without the government contributing something to make it happen, to make these rights real for the population. But again, I would suggest the dichotomy is a false one. And I've got a little handout here, which I'll give you in just a moment, that suggests why I think that's true. And last, the fourth myth is that economic, social, and cultural rights are, as they say, non-justiciable. That is, you can't take them to court. You can't take a right to food to court and say, I'm entitled to food, whereas you can take a right to free speech to court and say, I'm entitled to speak at this place at this time, and the police are trying to keep me from doing it, and you need to tell them to let me talk. Again, there is a whiff of truth to that, but I think one of the greatest growth in the academic literature around these issues today, and particularly even since I've started giving talks on munching on human rights in the last decade, has been the emergence of a huge literature on exercise of and protection, judicial protection of economic, social, and cultural rights. It's happened in lots of countries of the world, probably most notably in South Africa under the new South African Constitution, but also in other countries where the right to economic, social, and cultural right is litigated and decided. So the handout I'm sending around now addresses that issue of positive versus negative rights, and the issues that we assume are positive versus negative. This actually I did for last year, and you'll notice it has a 2012 date on it. Timeless. This is timeless. So it shouldn't make a lot of difference about that. But you can look down the list of rights that are presumed to be positive on the one side and negative on the other. But the real key to this is the piece of data on the back of the page. If you look on the back of the page, there are a number of scholars and litigators who are making the argument that human rights are permeable and that you can go back and forth, bridging between the two bodies of rights by talking about interdependent rights that exist in both treaty bodies and that can be enforced under both concepts. So litigation today oftentimes is cast in the context of one of these rights that gets you into the realm of an economic, social, and cultural right to enforce it. And one of the few examples in U.S. legal history in which that's happened, again, has to do with the right to education. But the case is Weiler versus Doe, a case that had to do with kids being deprived of education in Texas. And the issue was discrimination in access to education, not race per se. So race discrimination led to a favorable decision from the U.S. Supreme Court on the right to education for those kids in that particular case. So indirectly it dealt with education, but it was a discrimination-based case. So for those of you who are going to go out and practice and think about how you might be able to enforce these economic, social, and cultural rights, think about the window in through permeability, through the permeable rights that are on the second page of this particular document. So, we've got this standoff then between these two bodies of rights. And what I'd like you to do right now is take about 5 minutes and turn to a partner right next to you, someone sitting by you, and think about these two questions. I'm going to roll back to the rights themselves. Pick a right and defend it to your partner, and pick out one of these rights that you think is the most important, or to whom is it the most important. Pick one of those two questions. And then can you make the case in one sentence as to why this right is more important than any civil and political right? Okay? So these are the rights. Pick a partner, talk for 5 minutes, see if you can come up with the same right together, and then answer these two questions. Okay? Go do it. 5 minutes.
I like soap. You can't educate yourself. But I also like
No, but after that.
Okay, we're educated. Why do you think that state certificate is more important than any civil and right? Because without everything, you cannot oh, like you just never of the physical life and like your education they're all here, they're all how we're happy to figure out right.
Or something that private take care of the education side
One of the questions.
I guess rights are words you can think of as safety,
Yes. In our highway, and what's going on here in
to educate them, and we could either employ them or give them ways they can verify access to the means of the economy. We could let them language themselves. This lesson on notices for we educate them in that platform.
Rejoin us. Terrific. Love to hear you. You guys chatting it up. I trust you all had agreement. Did you? Good. Well, let's see how many people thought work and Social Security was the most important. How about adequate standard of living? 3. Food and water. I thought that was fair. Yeah. Are you putting that together? You're putting the two together. Okay. So we have a cluster around adequate standard of living, food, and water. How about housing? What do you voted for that, even though it's a whole new direction they're going? Health. Yeah, health. Health feels pretty important, doesn't it? Yeah, health is up there. How about education? Oh, a lot of education. Oh, yeah, big cluster back there. And how about cultural life? Cultural life is a hard one. It's a hard one to grab onto. Remarkably, this is one of the areas where there's a lot more written. So I would say, I'm looking around the kind of straw poll. I would say maybe education and health got a combined higher score than by a hair than adequate standard of living, food, and water. And it's also, I think you probably discovered, certainly when I've taught this course, that you feel like you can't talk about one of these rights without talking about the others, right? That you just can't separate the right to an adequate standard of living from food or health or education. They all feel like they're integral to a whole life, a life that is got possibilities in it. You've got to have some measure of all of them in some way. How about the argument, let me hear some arguments about why is this right more important than a civil and political right? Than any civil and political right? Anybody make that case? Yeah.
One of the points I made was that, so in the ICCPR and the Civil and Political Rights Covenant, you have the right to life, but it's more the right not to be arbitrarily deprived of your life.
Uh-huh.
But, the economic, social, culture, you also need the means of subsistence to have a right to life. And
terrific.
That includes food, water, health,
right.
Housing, related to the climate that you live
right.
in, etc.
So you tend to associate the right to life that's found in civil and political rights, and it is right up there at the very top of the list, with arbitrary deprivation of life, as opposed to something more like the right to survive and thrive that might be implicit in the right to access to food, education, health, all those things that make us whole and complete people.
One of the other things that just to know is also to take the right to education. But if you're undernourished or malnourished or other things, then even if you have access to the education, you're not going to be able to really make the most of it if you are having these other issues.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Any other defenders of economic, social, and cultural over civil and political? Maybe you think, yeah.
So the right of education should be important because without, being educated, you're not going to be able to fully exercise the civil and political rights. You're not going to be knowledgeable.
Right. You need to be knowledgeable and well-educated in order to exercise the vote, for example, to be fully informed. If you can't read, pretty hard to figure out how to vote, although it happens in a lot of countries. They use graphics and other ways of having people vote. So, but it's a very important concept that gives you access to meaningful civil and political rights. Yeah. One more? Yeah.
On health, I think the reason it is so fundamental is that it's a better measure of equality than any of the other measures. So from a way of operationalizing equality, it has many advantages that more subjective rights don't have. Life expectancy, for example, difference between life and death, these things are pretty clear-cut.
Really? Yeah. And you know, it's. I love the comment. I think it's. I actually share your view. Maybe as we get older, we're a little bit more concerned with health. But I think as the bodies that look at indices of life expectancy and issues about thriving in a particular country or a particular culture, they tend to look at the quality of life. And health and life expectancy, birth rates and infant death rates are all measures of a culture's strength and prosperity. And the absence of those indicators is oftentimes a great disincentive towards equality. A lot of people say, and I think last year my theme was the vast economic disparity between the rich and the poor that's growing not only in the United States but around the world, so that great wealth is concentrated in a very small portion of the population. And those two tend to equate with deprivation of rights that are more associated with economic, social, and cultural rights. Access to health, education, and an adequate standard of living are the issues that are least enjoyed by the population. So, terrific. I appreciate your engaging with it. Just to kind of round out the talk, there's an argument that certainly today, and this is the Vienna Declaration and Program of Action from the first worldwide conference on human rights held in 1993, where the countries involved made it pretty clear that they believe that economic, social, and cultural rights and civil and political rights are on a parity with each other, because they said all human rights are universal, indivisible, interdependent, and interrelated. Because they're giving us the message in 4 different words that says that you can't think about one of these bodies of rights without thinking about the other. So whatever we may say about positive and negative, or first generation and second generation, you've got to be able to think about them as one unified whole, or we're not thinking about fair and equal treatment around the world that's going to benefit everyone. And that goes for, one of the biggest controversies in this area about economic, social, and cultural rights is the obligation of the North, the prosperous North, to help the countries of the global South. So, economic assistance, things other than arms assistance, for example, military assistance. We're talking about food-based assistance or assistance in development. And in fact, there is a body of law on an international right to development that suggests that prosperous countries have an obligation to the rest of the world to make sure that those countries can prosper. It's almost a family concept. It's a concept that says that we take care of our siblings, our people within our family in a fair and equal way. We don't try to hoard for one person, although there are families where that doesn't happen. But we try to share. We try to share across the board and make sure everyone is able to survive and thrive. when we look at these two treaties, and I picked these two because they're just they present just such a wonderful juxtaposition between the two of them about how they're seen in the world. When we look at where they are, and this is as of this morning, I looked this up this morning, there are now 161 parties to the Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, and 167 parties to the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. So, very near equal. Both of them came into force in 1976. They were adopted in 1966. It took a decade for them to get entered into force. That is, enough countries signed on to them that they took force between the countries that had signed on. But today, a good deal of the world has signed on to these treaties. As I mentioned before, though, notably, there is a north-south distinction here. So China has ratified the Economic, Social, and Cultural Covenant, but not the Civil and Political, and vice versa for the United States. Has ratified the Civil and Political, but not Economic, Social, and Cultural. Okay? But what we see in practice, beyond that ratification, is three very different distinctions in the ways the treaty operates. One is the implementation language. Two is the derogation provisions. That is, when can you depart from the treaty? When can you give up your treaty obligations? When can you derogate, is the legal term, from your obligations under the treaty? And third, when can individuals make complaints about violations of the treaty? That's the third function that every treaty body has in the UN. I mentioned reviewing state reports, drafting general comments. The third is hearing individual complaints from people, individuals who say, your country violated my rights under this treaty. There are mechanisms for that. We're going to look at them real quickly. So this is the implementation language of the ICCPR. Pretty straightforward. Each state party undertakes to respect and ensure all individuals and subject to its jurisdiction are protected without distinction based on, and it goes on to talk about race and gender and all the other equality bases. Respect and ensure. Very strong language. Now, I apologize for this. The red doesn't show up so clearly, so I'll read it out loud to you. This is the language, implementing language of the Economic, Social, and Cultural Covenant, and I put these clauses in red because you can spend some time looking at all of them, and all of them are qualifiers. Each party to the present covenant undertakes to take steps individually and through international assistance and cooperation, especially economic technical, that's what I was talking about, North helping the South, to the maximum of available resources, I don't know what that means, with a view to achieving progressively. You see anything about progressively in that other treaty? No. The full realization of the rights recognized in the present covenant by all appropriate means, including particularly the adoption of legislative measures. It's got a lot of language in it and a lot of qualifiers. And the ones that lawyers have pointed to and diplomats point to most strongly are the ones about maximum of available resources and achieving progressively. Both of which suggest, well, maybe not, maybe mañana we're going to do this. We'll get to it, but we don't have to do it right now. We don't have to respect and ensure. We're going to do it progressively. It's going to happen, just not right now. Derogability. When can you depart from it? Well, there are a lot of rights in the ICCPR that are non-derogable. Most of them are provisions that have to do with rights to access to courts, protection of your life and protection of your property, those kinds of things. You just can't give those things up except in cases of national emergencies when the life of the nation is threatened. And only to the extent necessary and for the shortest period possible. Now, look at derogation under the Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. Only such limitations as are determined by law. Well, that means the country could just adopt a law that says, oh, well, please, sorry, we're not going to give you food today. Sorry, it's a law. Only insofar as this may be compatible with the nature of these rights and solely for the purpose of promoting the general welfare. Well, actually, the committee has read that clause to say no backsliding. And progressive implementation means you got to keep acting all the time towards implementation. And you can't depart from these obligations just because you have a national law that may conflict with the treaty. But it's much more slippery language than the other. And last are the optional protocols. Each of these treaties has an optional protocol, which is a protocol is an additional treaty. It's just a treaty that rides on another treaty that the people who have signed on to the original treaty can also sign on to if they agree to, that creates a right to individual to pursue cases against the country in question that's ratified the treaty. Well, if we look at the ICCPR, I put the entry into force on there. The optional protocol to the ICCPR has 144 ratifications and 35 additional signatories, and the committee that interprets the ICCPR has developed a significant jurisprudence on this. There are treatises in our library that are about like this on what the Human Rights Committee, which administers the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, has said about individual complaints that interpret the treaty. So many, many countries, and in fact, you all remember when Navi Pillay was here and she talked about which country has been the subject of most complaints under the ICCPR? And she said it was Sweden. And everybody went, really? What's Sweden doing that's so bad? And I actually wasn't quite so surprised, and actually in the first year course that I taught last year on human rights lawyering, we had a case that involves Sweden and its obligation not to return asylees to the country they come from under the Civil and Political Covenant because otherwise they might be tortured or killed. And people pursue cases against Sweden because lawyers are smart enough to figure out that Sweden will actually honor the decisions of the Covenant Committee and not send people back, even if Sweden itself says they should be sent back. So Sweden honors the decisions of the committee that makes these decisions. So lots of lawyers have turned to that committee to say, let's use the obligation of protection, so-called non-refoulement, not sending someone back to the country they're from if they are in danger of loss of their life or freedom. The Economic, Social, and Cultural Covenant, on the other hand, adopted much more recently, 11 ratifications. Last year it hadn't entered into force. It entered into force May 5th of this year. And it hasn't really done anything yet because it's just coming into being. So, why all these differences? Well, that's where I want to conclude. I think the differences are there because countries, even the countries that agree that these are universal and rights that have parity between them, there's still this persistent myth that economic, social, and cultural rights cost more to protect than civil and political rights. And maybe they do. But if you look at the list that I handed out to you that suggests that we tend to associate positive rights with one treaty and negative rights with another one, if you look at the positive rights in civil and political side, there are a lot of rights on that side that cost a lot of money. And we don't seem to blink at that. We seem to be quite happy to enforce the right to political participation. Think how much voting costs. Think how much fair trial costs. So there are a few rights that are negative, but there are also a lot of very costly rights on the civil and political side. And there are some rights on the economic, social, and cultural rights side where if government would stay out of the way, could be vindicated very easily. So, my favorite is the right to leisure rest, and rest from work. So vacation time. Get out of my way, government. I'm going to take my vacation. That's one of my economic, social, and cultural rights. Joining a union. Ooh, testy stuff. Gets very controversial. And we have very low union membership in the United States. But in Mexico last week, the teachers' union was sitting in on the plaza 2 blocks away from our hotel and had been there for a month, holding out for higher salaries. And they were marching every day past the hotel window in the morning. They were exercising their right to organize, as they have under the Mexican Constitution. So there are some rights that if government gets out of the way, people can exercise freely and fairly. And some rights that are going to cost us money. I think the historical reasons don't hold up anymore. And for those of you who are thinking about activism in the field of human rights, the area of economic, social, and cultural rights is one of the hottest areas in human rights law today, in part because a lot of the major conflicts that gave rise to the need for focusing on civil and political rights have gone by the wayside. So major conflicts, genocides, there are some, but they're not as frequent. So the need to protect against massive violence that's done in the name of civil and political rights, or that requires vindication through civil and political rights, is not as important or not as litigated, if you will, as some of the rights that have to do with the protection of economic, social, and cultural rights. So issues about famine and whether deprivation of food can be avoided. Amartya Sen argues that famine is something that doesn't need to happen and only happens when countries aren't attentive to the needs of their people, and that it's not just attributable to bad weather or climate, that you can avoid famine in modern times, and that if a famine happens, it's because of political reasons rather than natural reasons. So that says an awful lot about our issues about access to food, water, sustainable life. I'm going to stop there. I think we committed to go until 20 after 12, so we're pretty much out of time. It looks like there may be a class coming in here too.
At 2.
At 2? You guys have a class in here too? Okay. So maybe we have enough time. Is there a question or two, if we have it? Or we can, yeah.
On this Amartya Sen point, doesn't power really ultimately determine which rights are enforced, whether they're civil and political or economic?
Sure.
And what does it take to create positive rights in the United States?
Yeah. Well, today, I think these rights, the rights that we were looking at, the ones that are the economic, social, and cultural rights, that are clearly in the political arena, that's where it has to be by community action and by political activism that the rights are going to occur, and by the election of the officials who are most likely to vindicate these rights when they have power. So I think, I don't know, I have my own views on that, and you may believe that one party or the other is more likely to protect the right to health, education, housing, food, water, etc. I think that's the arena where that happens. It still is very rare that these issues get vindicated in the courts, which is where we lawyers like to do a lot of our work, right? We like to go to court, enforce the right, and it's very hard to do that. Although we have a project here called the Local Human Rights Project that's doing its best to implement human rights in the United States through litigation, legal aid offices, people who represent poor people who are using these instruments to try to aid in the interpretation of obligations under U.S. law to say, well, there's not just U.S. law here. We got a treaty that says people have a right to health, people have a right to education. And judges are listening. So it's a process of education. And I think the students coming out of this school and a lot of schools around the country are beginning to think about these as tools that they can use to help advance that. But right now I think it's much more about political activism than lawyers and courts, right? Any other question? Yeah?
I was just curious if we can give any thoughts on, I think, what role economic sanctions could play in terms of violating a state's ability to fulfill its obligations under the ESCR. So, I mean, obviously Iraq would be one example, but currently in Iran would be another.
Yeah. Sanctions are usually accepted by the world community, even the poor nations, as legitimate exercise of collective authority under the UN. As long as they follow the rules for the adoption of sanctions, most countries will go along with them. The arena where you see this come into much more political focus is the arena where you use economic sanctions against countries that don't comply with human rights, so that you say, if you want our aid money, if you want money to feed your poor or build housing in your country, you've got to comply with what we say are the human rights obligations you need to give to your people. And I think a lot of people say, justifiably, you can't condition the aid on us meeting your standards for what human rights are. We have people with very basic necessities. And I think even around the sanctions issues in Iraq, there was a lot of controversy about people who needlessly suffer, who aren't the target of the sanctions, and that the people who really control the power are the people with the wealth to avoid the impact of the sanctions, and that the poor are always the ones who suffer. There is a grain of truth to that. Okay. Thank you all. I really appreciate your coming out. And take a course on economic, social, and cultural rights. More detail. Thanks a lot.